I remember the first time Dad told me about his dream car. I must have been around 10 years old, sitting in the passenger seat of his beat-up old truck. We were driving back from one of our Saturday fishing trips, and the sun was setting, turning the sky into a canvas of oranges and pinks. Dad's hands gripped the steering wheel, and he glanced at me with that half-smile of his. "You see that car over there, Ryan?" he asked, pointing at a sleek, cherry-red Ford Mustang parked in a driveway. It looked like it had just rolled off the assembly line, shining even in the fading light. I nodded, and he chuckled. "That right there is my dream car, a 1967 Ford Mustang GT. I always thought if I could get my hands on one of those, well, I'd never need another car." Dad's face softened, and he turned back to the road, leaving me with the image of the Mustang and his words echoing in my mind. It wasn't the last time he talked about it either. Over the years, the dream would come up casually, when we passed another one on the highway, or when he'd see an ad online. But each time, the tone was always wistful, like he knew it was something he'd never have. Dad was never the kind of man to chase after things for himself. He worked long hours as a mechanic, and he spent most of his time fixing up other people's cars, while his own ran on borrowed time. When Mom got sick, he sold the little savings he had to pay the bills, never once complaining about what it cost him. And even when she passed, he stayed strong for me, doing everything he could to keep our lives from falling apart. Years went by, and that Mustang became a kind of symbol to me, a symbol of everything Dad had sacrificed, everything he'd never let himself have, because he was too busy making sure I had what I needed. I carried that thought with me, even when I moved away, went to college, and started my own life. And it was always there, in the back of my mind, as I built my career and tried to find a way to pay him back for everything he'd done. Then one summer, after I'd been working at my job for a few years, I started to think maybe, just maybe, I could make that dream come true. I'd saved up some money, enough that I wouldn't miss a big chunk of it if I spent it. And I figured, what better way to use it than to finally give Dad that Mustang he'd dreamed about for so long? The idea turned into an obsession. I spent weeks scouring online listings, looking for the perfect 1967 Mustang GT in the same cherry red Dad had always talked about. Most of them were out of my budget, but I wasn't willing to give up. I called collectors, scoured car forums, and even drove out of state a few times to check out leads. It felt like I was chasing a ghost, and some days I'd sit in my apartment and wonder if it was all worth it. But then I'd remember the look in Dad's eyes that day by the lake, and I'd know that it was. Finally, after nearly 3 months of searching, I found it, a man in Ohio who was willing to sell his restored Mustang. The price was high, but it was just within reach. I drained my savings and borrowed a bit from a friend to make it work. The day I wired the money, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely type. When the car finally arrived, it was everything I'd hoped for. It looked like something out of a movie, with that deep red paint and the polished chrome glinting under the sunlight. I knew that this was it. This was going to be the moment when I could give Dad something back, even if it was just a little piece of the happiness he'd always given me. I kept the Mustang at a friend's garage, planning how to surprise Dad. I thought about just showing up at his place with it, but that felt too easy. I wanted it to be special, something he'd remember forever. So I decided to wrap it into a day we'd already planned, a weekend visit when he thought I'd just be coming over for dinner. I could hardly keep my excitement in check every time we talked on the phone leading up to that day. Finally, the weekend came, and I drove the Mustang up to his house, parking it around the corner so he wouldn't see it. My heart was racing as I knocked on his front door like I was the one getting the gift. "Ryan, you made it," he said with a grin as he opened the door, pulling me into a hug. "How was the drive?" "Not too bad," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "But I brought you something." He frowned, and I could tell he was trying to figure out what I could have possibly brought that had me acting so strange. "Well, what is it?" "You'll see," I said with a laugh, grabbing his arm and leading him outside. I guided him down the street, making small talk, while he threw confused glances my way. And then, as we turned the corner, the Mustang came into view. I'll never forget the way Dad froze, his jaw dropping as he stared at it. His eyes darted from the car to me, and back to the car, like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "Is this—" he started, but his voice broke, and he had to swallow hard before he could finish. "Is this for real?" I nodded, barely able to keep the smile off my face. Yeah, Dad, it's yours. The 1967 Mustang GT, just like you always wanted. He stared at me, speechless, and for the first time in my life, I saw tears welling up in his eyes. This man, who had always seemed so strong, so unshakable, suddenly looked like a kid again, staring at the car like it was a miracle. Dad just stood there for a moment, staring at the car, like he was afraid that if he blinked, it would vanish. His hands trembled as he reached out to touch the Mustang's smooth hood, almost reverently. He ran his fingers over the curves, tracing the lines of the chrome trim, as if he was making sure it was real. I could see the emotions playing across his face, joy, disbelief, and a kind of deep, quiet gratitude that I had never seen before. Ryan, I don't even know what to say, he finally managed, his voice thick with emotion. You shouldn't have done this, son. It's too much. I shook my head, feeling a lump in my own throat. No, Dad, it's not too much. It's not even close to everything you deserve. You've given up so much for me over the years. This is just my way of saying thank you. He turned to me, and for a moment, we just looked at each other, father and son, sharing a moment that felt like it had been years in the making. He pulled me into a hug, holding on tighter than he ever had before, and I could feel his shoulders shaking as he tried to hold back his tears. When he finally let go, he took a deep breath, composing himself. Well, what are we waiting for? He said, a hint of that old grin breaking through. Let's take her for a spin. We both climbed into the Mustang, and the smell of the leather seats and the faint hint of motor oil filled the air, a scent that was somehow both new and familiar. Dad turned the key, and the engine roared to life, the deep rumble vibrating through the car. He grinned wider than I'd seen him smile in years, and I couldn't help but laugh, my own excitement bubbling over. As we pulled out of the driveway and onto the open road, I could see the joy radiating off him. He drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting out the window like he had done so many times in that old truck. But this time, he wasn't driving to a job or running errands. This time, he was just enjoying the ride, savoring the feel of the Mustang's power beneath him and the wind rushing past. We cruised down the highway, talking about everything and nothing. He told me stories I'd never heard before, about his first car, a rusted-out Chevy he'd fixed up in high school, and about the time he'd almost bought a Mustang when he was young, but backed out because the down payment was too much. I could hear the freedom in his voice, the way he sounded like a man who had just gotten a piece of his youth back. After a while, we pulled over by a little diner on the edge of town, the kind with neon lights and checkered floors. Dad parked the Mustang right out front, and we sat in a booth by the window, sipping coffee and watching the sun dip below the horizon. He kept glancing out at the car, a look of pure wonder in his eyes, like he still couldn't quite believe it was his. You know, Ryan, he said softly, swirling the coffee in his cup. I used to dream about driving one of these when I was your age, back when life was simpler, before all the responsibilities and the bills and, well, everything. I never thought I'd actually get one, but here we are. He paused, looking down at the coffee cup, and when he looked back up at me, there were those tears again, glistening in the dim light of the diner. I can't believe you did this for me. I don't know if I deserve it, but I'm so grateful. You've given me something I never thought I'd have. I reached across the table, squeezing his hand. You deserve this, and so much more, Dad. You've done so much for me, sacrificed so much. I just wanted to give you something back. I wanted you to know how much you mean to me. We stayed there for a while, talking and reminiscing, and for the first time in years, I saw a side of my dad that I hadn't seen in so long. A side that was hopeful and alive, a side that wasn't weighed down by all the years of working and worrying. And in that moment, I knew that the months of saving, the long drives to check out the car, and every penny I'd spent were worth it. When we finally got back into the Mustang to head home, the sky was dark, the stars beginning to twinkle overhead. Dad drove with the windows down, and the cool night air swept through the car, carrying away the years of worries and bringing with it a kind of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. As we pulled back into his driveway, he turned to me, and there was a quiet, almost reverent look in his eyes. This is the best day I've had in a long, long time, Ryan. I'll never forget it. I smiled back at him, feeling a warmth spread through my chest. "Me neither, Dad." And as he climbed out of the car, running his hand over the hood one last time before heading inside, I knew that I'd given him something far more than just a car. I'd given him a piece of his dream back, a piece of himself that he'd buried for so many years while taking care of me. And seeing him smile like that, seeing him with a little bit of that youthful joy back in his eyes, it felt like I'd given us both a second chance at something beautiful. That night, as I drove back to my own place, I couldn't help but smile the whole way. I knew that every time Dad turned the key in that Mustang, every time he took it for a spin, he'd remember this day. He'd remember that he wasn't alone, that his sacrifices hadn't gone unnoticed, and that there was someone out there who'd do anything to see him happy. And I think, in a way, that's what family is all about. Giving each other a little bit of joy, a little bit of hope, and sometimes, if you're lucky, a chance to chase a dream you thought you'd never catch.